Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about trust or bust, and on today's episode, it's specifically about Derrick Henry, running back of the Tennessee Titans. Now, many of us see Derrick Henry as a very controversial fantasy asset going into the 2019 fantasy season, and many of you have asked me, Andrew, what are your opinions on Derrick Henry? So I'm going to give you my thoughts on today's episode. Before we get into that, I want to go ahead and thank all of you who have subscribed to my YouTube channel, gotten me to the 5,000 mark. Thank you so much for joining the community, enjoying the content. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button. And for those of you who are already in the community and want to stay up to date, click that bell notification button to get my content to you as fast as possible. You'll be notified as soon as it comes out. So thank you again for all of you who have supported the channel. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, today we're talking about Derrick Henry and whether we can trust him going into 2019, whether we can draft him at his current ADP, or whether we should just avoid him altogether. Now, I want to kind of put aside my biases, and I don't want to go looking at Derrick Henry with a negative view or a positive view specifically. I kind of want to look at the pros and the cons of the situation, because I know there are many people in the fantasy landscape that are on both sides of the aisle, and I want to kind of look at both sides and then kind of go over it and give you guys my verdict for Derrick Henry as we approach his 2019 outlook. Okay, so specifically we're going to start with the pros. Okay, let's see what Derrick Henry has done right in his career and what looks promising enough to perhaps give us an opportunity to maybe take a chance on him and draft him this coming season, and or maybe just full send and target him. We'll see. But specifically, let's talk about his pros. Last season, what was he able to accomplish? He had 215 rushing attempts for 1,059 rushing yards, a 4.9 yard per carry average, which is pretty good, 12 total rushing touchdowns, 193.86 total fantasy points in a half-point PPR scoring format, and all of that averaged out to was 12.11 fantasy points per game. Pretty decent. Having only 215 touches, that's not great for a guy like Derrick Henry, but still he was able to produce with the amount of touches he had. And looking at his stats by the end of the season, it looked pretty good, right? Now, what are some other statistics that kind of stood out for me when I was researching and looking into Derrick Henry this coming offseason and as we approach 2019? Well, there was a couple big ones. Last season, Derrick Henry was tied for first in forced missed tackles. So on defenders, he forced 45 missed tackles, which was tied for first last season. And many of you may be thinking, Derrick Henry's a bigger running back. He runs downhill and he wants to run through you. But the fact of the matter is he's a lot more elusive than people anticipate or kind of give him credit for. So he's pretty good at going downhill and trucking people, but at the same time, he's pretty elusive, forcing 45 missed tackles, which was tied for first last season in the NFL. On top of that, he had 4.2 yards after contact per attempt last season, which was second in the NFL amongst all running backs that had over 100 rushing attempts. It's pretty good. 4.2 yards after contact. Not really much of a surprise considering how much we know that Derrick Henry is just a giant, 6'2", just running people over. On top of that, another big statistic, 24% of the rushing attempts that Derrick Henry had last season, 24% of the rushing attempts he had either were for touchdowns or first down conversions. So on 24% of his touches, he was either getting a first down or a touchdown last season. Pretty ridiculous on top of that. Now, let's look at the Tennessee Titans. What gives us a little bit of hope for Derrick Henry going into 2019? Let's look at their offensive line, and let's look at how much they've ran the ball in the past couple seasons. Offensive line-wise, they had the 9th-ranked offensive line according to Pro Football Focus last season through the 17 weeks, 16-game season. They're the number 9th-ranked offensive line. On top of that, this offseason, they went and they addressed a couple offensive pieces. They brought in Roger Saffold, left guard of the Los Angeles Rams, the All-Pro. So they went ahead and they went and improved their offensive line on top of the fact that they were already a top 10 at that position. Now, let's talk about the Tennessee Titans running the ball. Over the past 3 years, they've been in the top half of the league when it comes to rushing attempts per season. In 2016, they had the 4th most rushing attempts. 2017, a little bit of a dip with the 14th most rushing attempts. And last year in 2018, they kind of got back to where they're used to. They had the 9th most rushing attempts in the NFL last year, averaging 28.5 rushing attempts per game. Pretty good. And it's not too much of a surprise considering they also have the usage of Marcus Mariota, who takes his liberties here and there, has a couple designed runs, and moves his legs around. So obviously their rushing attempts are going to be a little bit higher, but still pretty good for this team. The Tennessee Titans, as of late, since Marcus Mariota has gotten to the organization, they haven't really been a passing team. They've been more of a run team and then focus on defense. And that's really what we've seen over the last couple of years, whether it was DeMarco Murray and or Derrick Henry, Dion Lewis in the last couple seasons. Let's talk about another big statistic that I always like to mention with Derrick Henry that's a big positive. This is one of the biggest stats that I think determines how a running back will finish their 2019 fantasy season, and that's red zone rushing attempts. I've always mentioned, the top 4 guys last season, or the top 5 guys actually last season: Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, and who am I missing? Todd Gurley, yeah, Ezekiel Elliott, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley. Thank you. All right, all 5 of those guys ended in the top 8 red zone rushing attempts and in the top 5 in red zone touches altogether. So those 5 guys, the reason they were the top 5 running backs last season was because they got a lot of work in the red zone and it led to a lot of scoring touchdowns. I mean, that's plain and simple where you're going to find value. Now, Derrick Henry, on the other hand, he did, pretty much the same. Even though he doesn't get as much work in the passing game, he had 43 rushing attempts last season in the red zone, which was 5th amongst all running backs, ahead of Ezekiel Elliott. Imagine that. And that all led for 10 rushing touchdowns. So again, he was given the opportunity in the red zone, and he acted upon it and got 10 rushing touchdowns for it out of his 12 total rushing touchdowns. Now, another pro that we can talk about, right? Now that we've went over all of his stats, and Derrick Henry has looked promising. His 2018 stats, looking at from the outside in, at this perspective, it looks like he can be a pretty decent running back, a good RB2 for any team. Now, the offensive coordinator of the Tennessee Titans last season, Matt LaFleur, he's moved on to the Green Bay Packers, like I mentioned last week with Aaron Jones. And the thing is, they've kind of hired within. They brought Arthur Smith, who used to be the tight ends coach for the Tennessee Titans. They've made him the offensive coordinator, right? He was kind of the helper of Matt LaFleur last season, so he kind of has an idea of this offense. And he has kind of said in the last couple of interviews as he's gotten the job that they want to kind of surround this offense around Derrick Henry, and they want to make sure that this team is very consistently running the ball, and they don't mind winning ugly games. If they have to give Derrick Henry the ball, 18 plus times a game and have their defense help them win games, they're willing to do so. So that's another promising step forward for the idea of, perhaps drafting Derrick Henry earlier or, targeting him in your draft. So a good offensive coordinator that's on board, that's not bad, because last season, majority of the season, we saw, Dion Lewis been given a lot of opportunity in comparison to Derrick Henry, and that kind of just flubbed a lot of Derrick Henry's value in the beginning of the season. But anyway, those are the pros from my perspective on how Derrick Henry could potentially, statistically, he's a machine. He is honestly a good running back. He is in a scheme. He's behind an offensive line that is just perfect for his style. Now he just needs the opportunity. He needs more touches. Now, let's go ahead and let's talk about the cons behind Derrick Henry. And I mentioned a lot of these last week during the live stream, and I kind of wanted to reiterate them to kind of give you guys, for those of you who are Derrick Henry truthers, I don't want to completely shoot you down, but these stats are kind of hard to ignore as we approach the 2019 fantasy season. So let's talk about it. Okay, from weeks 1 through 12, right? 11 games throughout the season, or the first 11 games of the season last year, weeks 1 through 12 for the Tennessee Titans. They had a bye week in there, no big deal. Derrick Henry scored 67.16 fantasy points. In 11 games, he scored 67.16 fantasy points, which not great at all. Okay, now the final 5 weeks of the regular season, weeks 13 through 17, he went ahead, he completely lost his mind and scored 115.6 fantasy points. So to put that in perspective, Derrick Henry went from averaging 6.1 fantasy points per game to then turning it around and averaging 23.12 fantasy points per game. First 11 games of the season, he was, in the first 11 games of the season, he was the number 42 ranked running back in half-point PPR scoring. In the first 11 games of the season. In the final 5, the dude completely lost his mind and took over. In fact, those 115.6 fantasy points accounted for 63.25% of Derrick Henry's season total. 5 games accounted for 63, almost 64% of his season's total. Now, that breakdown, those 5 weeks, there were a couple ginormous performances like I've mentioned before, but the fantasy points breakdown in those 5 games, 11.5, 47.8, that was the game where he destroyed the Jaguars, 29.74, he destroyed the Giants, which were terrible at stopping the run last season. I think they were giving up the 8th or 7th most points to opposing running backs last season. And then he finished the season against the Washington Redskins with 15.7 points and the Indianapolis Colts with 11.1. So we kind of see that, yes, he was still getting double-digit points, but that 47.8 and 29.74 fantasy point breakouts, they just threw everything for a loop, right? I mean, from my perspective here, if those games don't exist, Derrick Henry's not even being talked about. This video is never happening. But because he had those performances, people are thinking, well, perhaps Derrick Henry is actually really good. Perhaps he can do this on a weekly basis. The guy's not getting 33 rushing attempts on a weekly basis. Last season, from weeks 1 through 11, the guy only averaged 10 rushing attempts per game. Why? Because he was only averaging 3.68 yards per carry in those first 11 games. So as an offensive coordinator, how can you trust that? Right? When your game scripts are negative and you have to catch up, you have to put in a guy like Dion Lewis to give you an opportunity in the passing game, right? And on top of that, another statistic that really hurts Derrick Henry is the fact that he saw 8+ defenders in the box 32.09% of the time in 2018. The only other running back that was just as good as him in fantasy that had to deal with worse circumstances than that was Nick Chubb, who had to deal with 34% of the time the box had 8+ defenders. So Derrick Henry, yes, he's not alone in this idea of where he's getting defenders stacked up against him, but when he comes onto the field, defenders know they're running the ball. So that kind of kills it for the offensive coordinator. Sure, you can set up a lot of play action with that, but then where does Derrick Henry get his runs when there's 8 defenders in the box? It's so difficult for him to, have breakout games. There are games in the beginning of the 2018 season in which he had back-to-back weeks of 18+ carries, but he still was getting about 50 rushing yards per game. That's concerning. Yes, he had some fantastic performances at the end of the season, but can we fully trust that? That's the question. Now, on top of that, when we talk about his fantasy value, we also, like I just mentioned, Dion Lewis was a big part of this offense, and Dion Lewis played 61% of the snaps nearly, right? Derrick Henry just barely had 40% of the Tennessee Titans offensive snaps last season, which is awful, right? Derrick Henry should be seeing the field more. He should be seeing more touches. But if he is not reliable enough, and Dion Lewis has been reliable at some times, then Dion Lewis is going to see the field more. That's just how the cookie crumbles at this point. So Derrick Henry only seeing 40% of the offensive snaps last year. And once he was, he got in, the defense knew that they were going to run the ball. He didn't see any work in the passing game. Last season, like I mentioned before, only 15 receptions for 99 yards. Where is his fantasy value there? That doesn't really help. In PPR leagues, it's practically worthless. In a half-point PPR, you barely feel it. That's just the fact of the matter. He is a running back that only runs the ball. Sure, he'll get a couple screens here and there, maybe a couple flicks here, check downs. But other than that, he's not going to get much work in the passing game. And that's why I'm concerned about Derrick Henry going into the 2019 season. There are a lot of, there might be a lot of nice statistics saying, hey, Derrick Henry's a great player, but at the same time, there are just as many, cons to this argument to kind of make you a little weary on Derrick Henry's value in 2019. So now that we went over the pros and the cons, let's get to the question, trust or bust. Is Derrick Henry a guy that we can trust going into the 2019 season, or is he a bust? Now, like I mentioned before, Derrick Henry, yes, his stats looked great at the end of the year. And by no means, I'm not saying that Derrick Henry is not a good running back. The man is in the NFL, and he dominates at times. He is a great athlete, 100%. By no means am I saying Derrick Henry is not a good running back, because he is. If he was given the opportunity, if he was in an organization that knew how to use his skills and present him with an opportunity that could lead to success on a weekly basis, then Derrick Henry would be one of the top running backs in this NFL, right? Without a doubt in my mind. But that's not the current situation we have. The current situation, we have Derrick Henry going into the last year of his contract. He has a lot to prove. Is Derrick Henry a viable enough offensive weapon for the Tennessee Titans for them to hand him off the ball 15 plus times a game in order to get enough fantasy value for fantasy owners? And that's the big question. So where have I kind of landed on this argument? Let's look at his ADP specifically. Derrick Henry, as of right now, going in the third round, consensusly kind of sitting around RB number 18 as of right now. And I don't mind that specific spot. I think a low-end RB2 as such is not too out of sorts. I think that's where Derrick Henry will probably end up come the end of the 2019 season. But can we rely upon him to be in our lineups, right? Is he going to have those huge 25-point games and then turn around and have a 6-point game the next week? That's stuff that we can't really anticipate, nor can we really trust in going into a 2019 season. At his current ADP of a third-round running back, looking around the landscape, I believe there are probably more trustworthy running backs because of the fact that they're being used in the passing game, and they might just be the only running back on that respective team, right? With Derrick Henry having to also fight with Dion Lewis, Dion Lewis over 100 rushing attempts last season, dominated all the passing work. That hurts him. If that continues to, proceed, that's not going to help Derrick Henry get to his 275, rushing attempts that he needs to be a really relevant fantasy running back and have as much opportunity as possible. So currently, at his current ADP, I personally would not trust Derrick Henry. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm never going to draft him. That just means that as of right now, I'm not going out of my way to draft Derrick Henry in the third round. I feel like the way to mitigate that, if you want to go wide receiver early, then perhaps you might have to deal with the Derrick Henry in the third round. But if you go double RB, you're not going to have to take a third RB in that third round. You won't have to worry about a guy like Derrick Henry and his risk. I personally don't want to take the chance. As an RB2, it's just too risky in my eyes. As a flex position, RB3 on your team, perhaps I would take the chance. If he was to fall to me, the value potentially could be too sweet and I would not be able to pass on it. But as of right now, at his current ADP, I personally do not trust Derrick Henry. I don't think he's going to be a bust because the premise of that question kind of says, can we 100% say that Derrick Henry is going to be great or 100% say he's bad? That's very volatile. I don't think that's going to be exactly what we see. I think he's going to be landing in the middle. I think he's going to be a low-end RB2, and that's what we should anticipate him to be. So when you go out and draft, don't expect Derrick Henry to be a top 12 running back. Anticipate him being a lower-end RB2 and draft him as such. Because once he gets to that mid-tier RB, that lower-end RB2 value, that, in my opinion, is a success for him. The fact of the matter is, if he ends up there, I'll be surprised. But then again, he's done it before. He did it last year. He can do it again. So if he gets there, that's pretty much a success in my eyes for Derrick Henry and his owners. So that's what you should expect. But at the end of the day, I personally don't trust him. I wouldn't go out and target him specifically. But hey, let me know what you guys think. Hit me up down in the comment section. What other players? Maybe Amari Cooper, maybe a guy like, I don't know, who's a quarterback that's kind of sketchy. I don't know. Give me ideas. Who else should I go over when it comes to trust or bust? I'm going to make this a new series. So go down to the comment section. Let me know what you think about Derrick Henry. On top of it, give me some suggestions on other players. I know Amari Cooper's a guy that questions have kind of been risen up. That's why I brought him up. But let me know what you guys think specifically on Derrick Henry's situation and whether or not we should trust or, throw him to the side and say he's going to be a bust. I don't think he's going to be a bust. But RB2, draft him as such. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Happy 4th of July. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.